The world doesn't fear ignorance. It fears the ones who see too clearly too soon. You learned this in silence, and not because no one was speaking, but because you noticed what no one else did and then watched the room turn when you named it. You saw the lie behind the smile, the unraveling before the fall. You heard the unspoken grief sitting beneath the laughter, and you paid for that awareness, not with punishment, but with distance. They stopped asking what you thought. They laughed, then looked away. They told you kindly to lighten up. So you did what the wise often do to survive, and you made yourself simple. You asked questions you already knew the answers to. You laughed before the punchline to avoid being the one who ruined the mood. You began to serve others' comfort instead of your own clarity. And slowly you became a stranger to your own voice. There's a story whispered from east to west. A man named Nasruddin attends a lavish banquet in plain clothes and is turned away at the door. He returns dressed in gold-threaded robes and is welcomed with reverence. As the food is served, he spoons stew into his sleeve and says, "Eat, coat, eat, it's you they're honoring, not me." You've done the same. Worn the right version of yourself, said the right things, hidden the part that might make the room shift. And the world thanked you for it, but not you, the version of you that made no one uncomfortable. So you became skilled at pretending not to know, at letting others speak falsehoods and nodding along, at being the fool in the corner while quietly tracking every pattern others missed. But here's the truth buried in that disguise. You weren't trying to deceive anyone, you were trying to stay. Stay loved, stay welcome, stay protected. Carl Jung once wrote, "The persona is a mask that pretends individuality, but in reality it is a compromise between the individual and society." You made that compromise. And it worked until it started to cost more than it gave. Because after a while, pretending not to see becomes more painful than being misunderstood. And then the questions arrive. What happens when the fool remembers they were never foolish? What happens when the mask no longer feels like protection but a muzzle? What happens when the room you're in only accepts you if you pretend not to be you? That's the turning point. When silence no longer tastes like wisdom but like erasure. When you stop being flattered by being called easygoing and start feeling offended that no one has asked who you really are. When you realize you've been applauded for disappearing. And worse, you've gotten good at it. So here's what you must decide. Is this mask still serving you, or are you feeding it your life in pieces? You were not born to be a costume. You were not meant to be tolerated through dilution. You were made to be heard, not always loudly, but always truly. And if that means fewer rooms, so be it. Because the ones worth staying in won't ask you to perform your own disappearance. Let's keep going. There's more to unmask. You didn't vanish all at once. You disappeared in layers. It started with a truth you softened, then another you swallowed, then a version of yourself you stopped bringing to the room entirely. Because over time you learned that people like you best in pieces. So you gave them pieces, but the agreeable one, the calm one, the reflective one. Not because those weren't real, but because they were the least likely to be rejected. There's a name for this. Not surrender, not humility. Adaptation. But adaptation has its consequences, because when you shapeshift long enough to stay close to others, you often end up far from yourself. You knew the moment it began. You were in a room full of noise. Someone said something false. You felt your body rise to speak, but your mouth stayed shut. You smiled instead. You let it pass. You let it slide. And in that silence, something deeper slipped away. Not just your voice, your self-trust. You started questioning the validity of what you felt, because if no one else sees it, maybe it isn't real. But it was real, and you saw it, and you chose safety instead. Not because you were weak, but because you were tired of paying the price of being right. Simone Weil once said, "Every being cries out silently to be read differently." You've been crying out in silence for years, not with your words, but with your restraint. You didn't want to be invisible, you just didn't want to be punished for being real. So you became careful, measured. You tuned yourself like an instrument to others' comfort, and every time you hit a dissonant note, you rewrote the song, until the music of your inner life became background noise. And the worst part, they loved you for it. You were praised for your calm, for your steadiness, for being so easy to be around. But easy to be around often means you never let yourself be fully present. You became a ghost, present in outline, absent in essence. It hurts. And the world didn't notice because it was never looking for you. It was looking for what you made them feel. So here you are, still performing, still managing the temperature of every conversation, still pretending your truth is too sharp for this world. But what if that's not true? What if the people who pulled away when you showed your depth were never rejecting you, but retreating from their own unreadiness? And what if your silence has been mistaken for strength when it's really been exhaustion? You've carried the cost quietly, but the weight has grown. And now the disguise that once protected you feels like wearing someone else's skin. You've been disappearing to keep others close, but who stayed to keep you close? So that's the question no one asks. So let me ask it now. What if you spoke? What if you said the thing you always soften? What if you showed the version of yourself that doesn't wait for permission? Would the world collapse? Or would you finally hear the sound of your own voice in its full weight, not shaking, not disguised, but steady? This is the line in the sand. The moment before the return, not to who you used to be, but to the one you never let yourself fully become. The mask is itching, the ghost is done haunting rooms for scraps of safety. And your voice, the one that's been waiting, is ready to be heard again. Not because it will be understood by everyone, but because you are finally done misunderstanding its worth. Let's keep going. The silence has more to say. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means pressure. Unspoken truth doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It builds there. It festers. It waits. You call it calm, but it has weight. You feel it in your chest at night. You carry it in your shoulders. You hear it in the sound of your own laugh when it feels slightly out of place, and you've convinced yourself this is strength. To hold it in, to rise above, to carry what others refuse to see without making a sound. But holding doesn't heal. And rising above often means abandoning what's below. There is a story older than memory, of the shadow cast by a person's own unlived truth. Not evil, not broken, just exiled. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not as a villain, but as a part of the self that was pushed into silence. The truth we feared would cost us connection, the instincts we were told to tame, the power we shrank to keep the room steady. You've done this. Not out of shame, out of necessity. When your voice caused discomfort, you learned to whisper. When your insight was dismissed, you learned to defer. When your clarity frightened people, you learned to camouflage it as curiosity. And now, you carry a lifetime of sentences you never finished, of feelings you translated into politeness, of wisdom you disguised as questions just to make it digestible. But inside you, the truth never forgot itself. It became the part of you that clenches when you smile at something you don't agree with. It's the part that tightens when someone praises your patience, but never your vision. It's the part that weeps, not from sadness, but from the exhaustion of being restrained. This is your shadow, not the enemy, your lost twin, not the darkness, but the light you thought would be too much for the room. You've built a life around being good. But the shadow doesn't want you to be good. It wants you to be whole. And to be whole, you'll have to welcome the part of you that's angry, the part that regrets playing small, the part that no longer wants to explain itself to people who never asked to understand. There's a voice you buried to keep everyone else comfortable. It's still there, not bitter, not cruel, just tired of waiting. And when it returns, it won't ask for permission. It will rise like breath held too long. It will return with the sound of your own name, spoken clearly without apology. You once believed you could keep the peace by silencing yourself. But now you see what that silence cost. You didn't avoid conflict, you internalized it. You didn't protect relationships, you postponed authenticity. And now the echo of your own voice, once quiet, is calling you back. You're not here to be liked by everyone. You're here to live without splitting yourself in half. There is someone in you, watching, waiting, remembering, who never wanted to play the fool. They only played along so you'd survive, but you're not surviving anymore. You're ready to return. Not to war, not to noise, but to truth. Let's go deeper. You're close now. The mask cracked. Now it's time to look at what was underneath it all along. You've spent years being called wise for a version of you that doesn't exist. People praise your calm, your steadiness, your quiet smile in the middle of noise. But they don't know that silence was never peace. It was pressure, a constant compression of everything you saw but could not say. Because you don't speak to be heard. You speak only when the truth becomes heavier than the consequences. And most of the time it's not. So you keep it in. Not because you doubt your vision, but because you know what it costs to share it. You've seen how quickly a room turns, how fast admiration becomes unease when your words carry depth. You've watched people blink away from your gaze the moment they realize you're not just listening, you're understanding. So you learn to soften, to offer fragments instead of the whole. To laugh when you wanted to speak, to ask questions instead of making statements, to hide your clarity beneath layers of gentle uncertainty. And the world applauded you for it. They called you a great listener. They said you were safe. They said you were soothing. But what they really meant was, thank you for never making us uncomfortable. And you started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe truth isn't welcome. Maybe clarity is too sharp to be shared. Maybe your knowing is too much. So you stayed quiet. And every time you silenced your voice to protect someone else's comfort, you abandoned a part of yourself that just wanted to be known. There's a paradox in you, and it's been stretching you thin for years. You long to be seen, but when someone gets too close, you vanish. You crave connection, but you only show the rehearsed parts, the curated version you hope won't scare them off. You want to be understood, but you've taught people to love your mask. So now, when they say they know you, you don't believe them, because they've never met the version of you who speaks before softening, who tells the truth without editing, who walks into a room not wondering how to fit in, but wondering if this room can hold what you bring. You've hidden that version, not just from them, from yourself. And now the cost is becoming unbearable. You sit in rooms where you are praised and feel lonelier than you did in solitude. You are starving, in places where you're being complimented. You sit in a room full of voices. Someone says your name with affection. And still, your chest tightens because you know they love the mask and you're not sure if they'd love the one who made it. That's the fracture. The one no one else sees, the one you've learned to carry quietly. There's a line in the old stories, the seer who lives at the edge of the village, feared, respected, consulted only when the world starts falling apart. Until then, they are left alone because their truth unsettles. You've lived at that edge too, not in exile, but in restraint. You've built friendships on fragments. You've built trust on silence. And now you wonder who would still be here if you let the full truth of your voice rise. Simone Weil once wrote, "The love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say, 'What are you going through?' You've been asking that question your whole life. In your presence, in your attention, in your listening. But here's the question you've never asked yourself out loud. What are you going through? What have you swallowed so many times that you've begun to believe your own silence? Because the ache is no longer ignorable. The tension is no longer subtle. And your voice, the one you've trained so well to wait, is beginning to rise without permission. You don't need every room to understand you. You just need to stop misunderstanding yourself. This is not about being loud. This is about being clear. You were not born to echo the comfort of others. You were born to speak what only you can see. Let them call you too much, too deep, too sensitive, too intense. Better than to be loved for what you never were. You've softened your edges long enough. Let this be the moment you stop apologizing for your vision. The room may not be ready, I doubt, but you are. There comes a moment when the act begins to collapse under its own weight, not with drama, not with fire, but like a roof giving in under years of quiet pressure. You've played the fool long enough to forget it was a role. You've worn the mask long enough to mistake it for your face. But something in you is shifting. It doesn't want to disappear anymore. It doesn't want to be safe. It wants to be true. And the truth, you're not tired because you've done too much. You're tired because you've said too little of what mattered. You've watched the moments pass where you could have said the thing, but you didn't because you've been trained by consequence and trained well. Now you carry the residue of all the times you smiled when you should have spoken, laughed when you should have challenged, left quietly when you should have stood your ground. The act is cracking. The echo is getting louder, and the voice you buried under politeness and pattern recognition is no longer asking for permission. There is a version of you that existed before you learned to edit yourself, before the world told you to turn your wisdom into whispers, before you became skilled at shrinking. That version of you is not gone. It is waiting. It is watching how long you'll continue pretending that being understood doesn't matter. That being honest isn't worth the risk. That being liked is enough. But you've tasted what it costs. You've eaten meals at tables where you said nothing real and went home starving. So now, the question isn't what if I speak, it's what happens if I never do. This is not about being loud, it's about being intact. There's a moment in every life, quiet and invisible, where we stop protecting the parts of ourselves that were never dangerous to begin with. This is that moment. Not because you're ready, but because the consequences of silence are finally louder than your fear of being misunderstood. You don't need a platform, you need presence. You don't need to be louder. You need to be heard by the person you've abandoned the longest, yourself. Carl Jung once said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You cannot become by performing. You can only become by returning to the truths you swallowed, the instincts you buried, the parts of you wrapped in softness just so others would stay. Let them go. The ones who loved the version of you that never asked for anything. They were never loving you. They were loving their reflection in your restraint. Let them go. Because what waits on the other side of the mask is not a storm. It's clarity. Not conflict, but a kind of stillness that comes only from no longer apologizing for your own existence. There is a word for this moment. It's not rebellion, it's integration. It's what happens when the fool removes the costume, not to become someone else, but to become the sage that was hiding underneath it all along. This is your return to center, to honesty, to gravity. You're not stepping into a spotlight, you're stepping back into alignment. Your voice doesn't have to be polished, it just has to be yours. This isn't about convincing anyone, it's about no longer betraying yourself. And that is the quietest and most sacred kind of power. Let's keep going. You're almost home. You were never pretending out of weakness. You were pretending out of wisdom in a world that could not yet hold your truth. You learned early that insight comes with a cost, that knowing too much isolates, that seeing too clearly makes people look away. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right before they were ready. So you made yourself smaller. You quieted your vision. You became soft where you could have been sharp, invisible, where you could have illuminated. And for a time, it worked. You stayed in rooms that would have cast you out had they seen the full weight of your presence. You kept connections by keeping parts of yourself in the dark. You told yourself that staying mattered more than being seen. But over the years, the silence became too loud, the applause too hollow, the reflection in others' eyes too unfamiliar. You can feel it now, not as a scream, but a thrum beneath your skin, a truth that doesn't want to be profound, it just wants to be real. You laugh a little too late, you nod when you want to pause. You feel the tug to interrupt with something true, and then don't. And afterward, a quiet grief, the kind you can't name in conversation, the kind that comes from betraying yourself one gesture at a time. This is not about rebellion. This is about return. The fool's mask is fraying. The persona that once served as your passport to safety now hangs heavy on your skin, and beneath it there is someone waiting. Not someone new, someone ancient, a part of you that never flinched from the truth. The one who watched all these years as you played along. They're done waiting. There's a stillness in you now, not the stillness of fear, but of readiness. Yes, you've outgrown the performance and the rooms that asked you to perform, but this is the sage the fool was always becoming. Not the one who speaks the most, but the one who no longer swallows what matters. You no longer need to be loud, you need to be undeniable. Let them call you too quiet, too deep, too intense, too much. They are naming your medicine, mistaking it for poison, because they've never tasted something that couldn't be sweetened. Let them. Because those who can hold your truth will stay, and those who can't were never holding you, only your convenience. You've spent years pretending to be simple so you wouldn't scare anyone. But the world doesn't need simpler people. It needs people who've stopped performing. David Whyte once wrote, "Sometimes the truth depends on a walk around the lake. You've walked it, quietly, for years. And now the truth is no longer a distant shore, it's where you are standing. This is your voice, not perfect, but intact. This is your truth, not polished, but present. This is your arrival, not into the spotlight, but into yourself. So speak, even if your voice trembles, even if it empties a room, even if no one clapped, because the first time you say something real, the mask falls. And what's underneath is not fragile, it's not broken, it's the quiet, burning clarity of a life finally aligned. You no longer need to spoon truth into a sleeve just to be fed. Eat coat, that part is over. This time you sit at the table as yourself, and the feast is presence. If this voice was yours, say so. Say it in the comments, say it in your own life, say it for the version of you who stayed quiet just to be allowed in the room. And if this story echoed something you carried, don't walk away feeling seen, walk away showing. Share it, not for reach, but because someone else is starving for a voice that sounds like their own. Sir, you've mastered the art of pretending, now master the art of returning. The fool was never foolish, they were just waiting for the room to be ready. And if it's not, you speak anyway, because the silence has served its purpose, and now, so will you.